This is the story of the wildest lawman to ever exist, Dirty Harry. In the early 1970s, San Francisco was a city at a crossroads. Known for its iconic Golden Gate Bridge, rolling hills, and vibrant cultural scene, it was also a place grappling with a dark underbelly. The city was no stranger to crime and corruption, but as the decade dawned, it found itself in the grip of fear, driven by the actions of a cold-blooded killer known only as Scorpio. Against this backdrop, a lone figure stood as a symbol of unwavering determination and brutal efficiency. Harry Callahan, a police inspector whose methods were as controversial as they were effective. Harry Callahan, better known by his moniker Dirty Harry, was not your typical cop. Tall, rugged, and with a perpetual squint, he carried himself with a steely resolve that left little room for doubt. He was a man defined by his actions, a cop who operated on his own terms, in a city that was spiraling into chaos. As much a part of San Francisco as the fog that shrouded its streets, Callahan was both feared and revered by those who knew him. His story, much like the city he served, was one of contradictions, honor and ruthlessness, law and lawlessness. The tale of Dirty Harry is a story of pursuit, of an unyielding man chasing an equally unyielding villain through a labyrinth of violence, politics, and moral ambiguity. But it is also a story of the city itself, a place caught in the throes of change, where the line between good and evil was often blurred. This deep dive will unravel the intricate threads of this narrative, tracing Harry Callahan's journey from a seasoned detective to a reluctant hero, and ultimately a legend. Chapter 1. The City and its Lawmen. San Francisco in the early 70s was a place of contradictions. The peace and love era of the 60s had given way to a more cynical and fractured time. The remnants of the counterculture movement still lingered in the Haight-Ashbury district, but the city was also facing a surge in crime rates. Bank robberies, homicides, and drug-related offenses were on the rise, creating a palpable sense of unease among its residents. Amidst this turmoil, the San Francisco Police Department struggled to maintain order, often finding itself outmatched and overwhelmed. Harry Callahan had been a part of the SFPD for nearly 2 decades by the time the events that would define his career began to unfold. A native of San Francisco, Harry had joined the force in the early 50s, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to serve the city he loved. Over the years he had worked his way up through the ranks, earning a reputation as a tenacious and effective detective. But it wasn't just his success in closing cases that set him apart, it was his approach. Callahan was known for his unconventional methods and a seeming disregard for the bureaucratic procedures that often hamstrung his colleagues. He wasn't above bending the rules if it meant getting results, and he was quick to resort to force when he deemed it necessary. His colleagues gave him the nickname Dirty Harry, not only because of the dirty jobs he was often handed, but also because of his willingness to get his hands dirty to get the job done. Despite his controversial methods, Harry was respected by those who worked with him. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. His personal life, however, was less well known. A widower, Harry had lost his wife to a tragic car accident several years earlier, a loss that had left him emotionally scarred and deeply private. He had no children, no close family to speak of, and his work had become his life. The job was his way of coping with the pain, a means of channeling his anger and frustration into something productive. Harry's partner, Frank DiGiorgio, was one of the few people who knew him well. A fellow veteran of the force, DiGiorgio was a stark contrast to Callahan. Jovial and easygoing, he was a family man with a wife and kids, and he often served as a calming influence on Harry. Despite their differences, the two shared a mutual respect and a deep bond forged through years of working the streets together. The city's police force, though diverse in its ranks, was united by a common enemy: crime. But it was an enemy that seemed to evolve faster than they could adapt. And when Scorpio appeared on the scene, it was clear that they were facing a different kind of threat, one that would test the limits of their resolve and force them to confront the very nature of justice itself. Chapter 2. The Emergence of Scorpio. Scorpio, as he came to be known, was unlike any criminal San Francisco had ever encountered. He was a man with no known past, no discernible pattern, and no clear motive beyond a twisted desire to create chaos. His real name was never revealed, his identity shrouded in mystery. To the police and the public, he was simply Scorpio, a moniker derived from the symbol he left at the scene of his crimes, a taunting signature of his sadistic handiwork. Born in obscurity, Scorpio's early life was marked by instability and neglect. Abandoned by his parents at a young age, he grew up in a series of foster homes where he experienced physical and emotional abuse. By the time he was a teenager, he was already showing signs of severe psychological disturbance. His school records, what little there were, painted a picture of a deeply troubled young man prone to violent outbursts and self-destructive behavior. As an adult, Scorpio drifted through life, moving from town to town, never staying in one place for too long. He worked menial jobs, lived in seedy motels, and kept to himself. He had no friends, no connections, and no traceable history. He was a ghost, invisible to the world until he decided to make his presence known in the most horrifying way possible. Scorpio's first known act of violence in San Francisco was the murder of a young woman in a park. It was a seemingly random act, brutal and senseless. But it was only the beginning. He followed this up with a series of sniper attacks, targeting random citizens from rooftops and high vantage points. The city was paralyzed with fear, and the police were at a loss. Scorpio's attacks were erratic, his methods unpredictable. He seemed to strike without rhyme or reason, choosing his victims at random and leaving little evidence behind. His killing spree was not motivated by financial gain, revenge, or any clear ideological belief. It was as if he killed simply for the thrill of it, deriving a perverse satisfaction from the terror he inflicted on the city. The randomness of his attacks made him all the more terrifying, a specter of violence that could appear anywhere, at any time. The police were left scrambling, frustrated by the lack of clues and the public's growing hysteria. Newspapers dubbed him the Zodiac's Shadow, a reference to the infamous Zodiac killer who had haunted Northern California just a few years earlier. But unlike the Zodiac, whose cryptic messages had offered some twisted logic behind his killings, Scorpio seemed to revel in his anonymity. He made no effort to communicate with the authorities, no demands, no manifestos. He was simply a force of chaos, a human predator stalking his prey. Harry Callahan was one of many detectives assigned to the case, but it was clear from the beginning that he took a special interest in bringing Scorpio down. Harry had seen his share of killers in his years on the force, but something about Scorpio got under his skin. Perhaps it was the randomness of the violence, the senselessness of it, or the way Scorpio seemed to mock the police with his elusiveness. Whatever the reason, Harry made it his personal mission to end Scorpio's reign of terror, even if it meant bending or breaking the rules to do so. Chapter 3. The First Encounter. The first significant encounter between Harry and Scorpio occurred during a tense stakeout. After days of fruitless searching, a tip from a street informant led the police to believe that Scorpio would strike at a local swimming pool. Harry, ever the maverick, chose to go alone, staking out the area from a concealed position. When Scorpio appeared armed with a rifle, Harry confronted him in a brief but intense standoff. The encounter was marked by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Scorpio's mocking laughter. It was clear to Harry that this was no ordinary criminal. Scorpio was enjoying the cat-and-mouse game, taunting the police and daring them to stop him. Despite Harry's efforts, Scorpio managed to escape, slipping away into the night. The failed attempt weighed heavily on Harry, who was frustrated not only by the killer's escape, but by the bureaucratic red tape that seemed to hinder every step of the investigation. The department, fearing public backlash, was reluctant to give Harry the leeway he needed, insisting that he follow procedure. But Harry, never one to be constrained by rules, began to operate on his own terms. Chapter 4. The Media Frenzy. As the body count continued to rise, the media descended on the story with a frenzy. Every new attack was front-page news, every detail dissected and analyzed. The public's fear turned to anger as the police seemed powerless to stop the killer. News reporters hounded the SFPD for answers, demanding to know what was being done to catch Scorpio. Scorpio, ever the opportunist, took advantage of the media circus. He began sending taunting letters to local newspapers, each one more chilling than the last. In one particularly disturbing message, he promised to continue killing until he was paid a ransom of $100,000. The letter was accompanied by a chilling photograph of his latest victim, bound and gagged, with a newspaper showing the current date, proof that she was still alive, but not for long. The city was in an uproar, and the pressure on the police force was immense. The mayor, bowing to public demand, ordered the police to comply with Scorpio's demands, against Harry's strong objections. Harry knew that giving in to the ransom would only embolden the killer, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The city was desperate, and in their desperation they were willing to gamble with the lives of innocents. Chapter 5. The Kidnapping and the Ransom. The tension reached a boiling point when Scorpio kidnapped a young girl, Mary Deacon, as she walked home from school. The city was thrown into panic as news of the abduction spread. Scorpio sent another letter to the police, this time demanding that the ransom be delivered by Harry Callahan himself. The message was clear: this was personal. Harry, despite his misgivings, agreed to the mayor's orders and prepared to deliver the ransom. The handover was a nerve-wracking ordeal. Harry, armed but alone, carried a briefcase filled with marked bills as he followed a series of cryptic instructions left by Scorpio. The chase took him across the city, from payphone to payphone, each one delivering a new set of directions. The final rendezvous point was a remote spot near the Golden Gate Bridge. There, Harry found himself face to face with Scorpio for the second time. But this time, the killer had the upper hand. He ambushed Harry, beating him savagely and taunting him with the knowledge that he had outsmarted the police once again. He then fled, leaving Harry battered and the ransom money untouched. When the police arrived, it was clear that the exchange had been a setup from the start. The girl was nowhere to be found, and Scorpio had vanished into the night. For Harry, the failure was a bitter pill to swallow. He had been outplayed, humiliated, and a young girl's life hung in the balance. It was a low point, but it only strengthened his resolve. He would find Scorpio no matter the cost. Chapter 6. The Chase. In the days that followed, the search for Scorpio intensified. Every available officer was put on the case, and the city was effectively locked down. Harry, despite his injuries, refused to be sidelined. He knew that time was running out for Mary, and he was determined to be the one to bring her home. Using his network of informants and contacts, Harry began to piece together a profile of Scorpio. He learned that the killer had a fascination with military history and weaponry, a detail that would prove crucial in the days to come. But it was a tip from an unlikely source that finally gave Harry the break he needed. A homeless man who had been squatting near a remote part of the city reported seeing a man matching Scorpio's description entering an abandoned warehouse late at night. Harry and his new partner, Inspector Chico Gonzalez, moved quickly, conducting a covert surveillance operation on the location. They observed Scorpio entering and leaving the building several times, always alone and always carrying a large duffel bag. It was enough to convince Harry that they had found their man. That night, they moved in. The raid was swift and brutal, with Harry and Chico storming the warehouse, guns drawn. What they found inside was a macabre scene: weapons, maps, and photographs of his victims, including the still-living Mary, tied to a chair in the corner. Scorpio, caught off guard, tried to flee but was tackled by Harry. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Harry, his fury barely contained, demanded to know where the girl was. Scorpio, laughing through bloodied lips, taunted him, refusing to give up the information. In a moment that would later haunt him, Harry drew his .44 Magnum and pressed it to Scorpio's head, demanding answers. It was Chico who stopped him, pulling him back before he could pull the trigger. "We need him alive," Chico reminded him. Harry, breathing heavily, lowered his weapon, and Scorpio was taken into custody, still smirking. Chapter 7. A Broken System. The arrest of Scorpio should have been a victory, but it quickly turned sour. The evidence gathered during the raid was deemed inadmissible in court due to the lack of a proper warrant. Harry's unorthodox methods once again came back to haunt him. Scorpio's lawyer, a slick and well-connected attorney, argued that his client's rights had been violated, and to the shock of the entire city, Scorpio was released on a technicality. Harry was livid. He had seen the darkness in Scorpio's eyes, the malevolent glee as he had taunted them with the girl's fate. To see him walk free, protected by the very laws that were supposed to protect the innocent, was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a moment that crystallized Harry's already jaded view of the justice system. In his eyes, it was a system that protected the guilty and left the innocent to fend for themselves. Despite the setback, Harry refused to give up. He knew that Scorpio would strike again. It was only a matter of time, but this time, he wouldn't let the law stand in his way. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. Scorpio, now emboldened by his release, wasted no time in resuming his campaign of terror. His next act was a brazen attack on a city bus, taking its passengers hostage and demanding that the city pay him an exorbitant sum, or he would kill them all. The situation was dire, and the police were at a loss. Harry, sidelined by his superiors, took matters into his own hands. Armed with his signature .44 Magnum and a grim determination, he tracked the bus as it made its way through the city. He intercepted it near the outskirts, commandeering a car and driving alongside the moving vehicle. What followed was a harrowing chase through the streets of San Francisco, culminating in a dramatic crash that sent the bus careening off the road. Scorpio, bloodied but still defiant, emerged from the wreckage, using a young boy as a human shield. Harry, his heart pounding, took careful aim with his .44 Magnum. Every muscle in his body was taut as he faced down Scorpio, who held the terrified child in front of him like a grotesque shield. The scene was eerily silent, the tension palpable as onlookers held their breath. For a moment time seemed to stand still. "Go ahead," Scorpio sneered, his voice dripping with venomous glee. "Make my day." The phrase hung in the air, a taunt designed to provoke Harry, to push him into making a fatal mistake. But Harry Callahan was no rookie. He knew this was his one chance to end it, and he wouldn't let Scorpio take another life on his watch. With the calm precision that came from years of experience, he squeezed the trigger, his shot true and lethal. The bullet tore through Scorpio's shoulder, causing him to stumble backward, releasing the boy who ran to safety. Harry advanced, his gaze never leaving Scorpio as he dropped the revolver, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You're under arrest, Scorpio," Harry growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. But Scorpio, ever the coward, made a last desperate move, lunging for Harry's gun. The two men struggled, grappling in the dirt and grime of the street, their hatred for each other boiling over in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Harry, despite his injuries and fatigue, overpowered Scorpio, slamming him to the ground. As the killer lay there, bloodied and beaten, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small knife and swiping wildly at Harry. Without hesitation, Harry drew his backup weapon, a smaller revolver hidden in his ankle holster. "Do you feel lucky, punk?" Harry's voice was ice cold, his finger hovering over the trigger. Scorpio, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, spat blood and bile, his eyes wild with fear and defiance. "Go to hell!" Scorpio screamed, but before he could make another move, Harry fired, the shot ringing out like a final, resounding note of justice. Scorpio's body jerked violently as the bullet hit him square in the chest, his eyes widening in shock before the life drained out of them. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally, mercifully, over. Harry stood over the corpse, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion. He glanced down at the lifeless body of the man who had tormented the city for so long, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in the kill, only a grim sense of relief. It was over. For now. The sirens of approaching police cars broke the silence, and Harry turned, walking away from the scene as the first responders swarmed around him. He handed his badge to a bewildered officer, his resignation unspoken but understood. Harry Callahan had done what needed to be done, but he knew that the cost had been high, too high. He was tired, weary of the fight that seemed never-ending. He had become a legend in the eyes of many, but for Harry, it was a hollow victory. The system he had sworn to uphold was broken, and he was no longer sure if he could be a part of it. Chapter 9. Aftermath and Legacy. The dust settled over San Francisco, and life, as it always does, moved on. The city began to heal from the terror inflicted by Scorpio, but the scars remained. People spoke of Harry Callahan with a mixture of admiration and fear, his name synonymous with a hard, uncompromising form of justice. The story of Scorpio's defeat was recounted countless times, each retelling adding to the myth of Dirty Harry, a man who did what others couldn't or wouldn't to keep the city safe. For Harry, the victory was hollow. He had ended Scorpio's rampage, but the cost was steep. He had seen the limits of the law, the fragility of the system he had sworn to uphold. He had saved lives, but at the price of becoming something he wasn't sure he recognized. The lawman who had once believed so deeply in his duty was now a man who questioned everything, the rules, the system, and even himself. He returned to the force, but it wasn't the same. The badge, once a symbol of his identity, now felt like a weight. Harry continued to serve, not out of obligation, but because it was all he knew. He chased criminals, walked the beat, and kept the city in his unyielding gaze. But a part of him always remained distant, a ghost in the city he had given so much to protect. The years passed, and with them came new challenges, new faces, and new battles. Harry fought them all with the same dogged determination, but there was an inevitability to it. He was a man from a different era, and as the city evolved, he remained a stubborn, solitary figure standing against the tide. In the quiet moments, Harry would think of those who hadn't made it, his fallen colleagues, the innocents lost to the cruelty of men like Scorpio, his own wife taken too soon. He had outlived them all, and sometimes, that felt like the cruelest punishment of all. But in those same moments, he found solace in knowing that he had done his part. He had stood his ground when it mattered most. Harry Callahan retired from the force with little fanfare. There were no parades, no speeches. He left quietly, just as he had lived, slipping away into the city that had defined him. He had done his duty, had faced the darkness without flinching. He had been a guardian, a protector, and yes, a killer. But he had been necessary. In the end, Harry knew that he was never truly at war with Scorpio or the criminals he hunted. His battle was with the darkness in himself, the fine line between justice and vengeance, between being a cop and becoming the very thing he fought against. It was a war that never really ended, but he had fought it as best he could. Harry Callahan became a legend in San Francisco, his story woven into the fabric of the city. He was remembered not just for his deeds, but for his unyielding spirit, his refusal to back down in the face of evil. And though the man himself was flawed, his legacy was one of strength, of courage, of a relentless pursuit of what was right. Years later, when people spoke of Dirty Harry, they would say that he was the man who did what needed to be done, who carried the weight of the city's fears on his shoulders and never buckled. He was a man who, despite everything, still believed in something better. And in a world that so often seemed lost, that belief, that stubborn, uncompromising belief, was something rare and precious. Harry Callahan faded into the city he had given so much to, but his story lived on, a testament to the struggle of one man against the chaos. He was gone, but the legend of Dirty Harry, of the man who wouldn't back down, who would always ask, "Do you feel lucky?" remained.